Hello, and thank you for joining us for another MaritzCX webinar. I'm Tom Evans, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, the ROI of VoC, using linkage analysis to connect voice of customer to business outcomes. On the program with me today are our two presenters, Juraj Kavecansky and Joseph White, and we'll get to know them a little better in just a minute. But before we get started, let's answer a couple of questions up front, and those are, first, is the webinar being recorded? And yes, it is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the presentation within the next 24 hours. And then secondly, are we planning to have a time of Q&A after Joseph and Juraj conclude the presentation? And yes, we are. And if you have a question during the presentation, just type it into the question box on your screen, and we'll get to as many of those submitted questions as we can during that Q&A time. So thanks for hearing that, and now let's meet today's presenters, starting with Juraj. Juraj is Director of MaritzCX's Advanced Analytics Department, and he has over 20 years of marketing sciences experience serving in advanced analytics and marketing sciences consultant roles. He provides consultation analytical support in the areas of research design, sampling, multivariate statistics, and reporting. He is experienced in the selection and application of the right statistical technique to address client objectives, and he has managed a large number of custom research studies, including customer satisfaction tracking studies, product development, and studies that link CXE to operational metrics and the bottom line, as well as segmentation studies. He holds a BS in physics from Charles University and a MS and PhD in biophysics from Comenius University. So we're happy to have Juraj join us today. And then starting out, the presentation will be Joseph White. Joseph is Senior Director of Marketing Science for MaritzCX, where he also provides, like Juraj, support and consultation on the analytical aspects of research design, sampling, multivariate statistics, and modeling, as well as reporting. And Joseph currently supports the financial services practice within MaritzCX, but he is well-versed in providing analytical expertise to a wide array of marketing research studies in a variety of industries. And Joseph holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master's of Arts degrees in economics with a focus on econometrics, forecasting, and international trade from the University of Colorado at Denver. And he has his ABD in economics from the University of California, San Diego, where his focus was on theoretical and applied econometrics and microeconomics. So Joseph, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thanks, Tom, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today. We're going to start off here with an outline of our discussion and the agenda. So I'm going to start this off, and I'm just going to give a pretty high-level view of linkage analysis in general, talk about what it is, why we might want to do it, and then a few different types of linkage analysis at again, a pretty high level. Juraj is going to take over, and he's going to walk through some actual the process of linkage analysis, starting from setting yourself up for success through actually conducting the analysis, and then finally how you would leverage the results. So to start off, what is linkage analysis? So it's always good to have a definition, and our view is that linkage analysis linkage is the formal statistical process of bringing together information from multiple data sources for the purposes of explaining an outcome or a relationship. And at the core here really is that idea of bringing disparate data sources together and being able to link them to provide better insights. So, what kind of data sources are we talking about? This is certainly a very limited number of data sources, but in the world of customer experience or marketing research, we can think of social media. What's the buzz about your brand? Is there a relationship between that and, maybe your brand perception or customer favorability? We also have operational data, right? So it includes things like product configuration for perhaps hardware or a physical product. It includes interactions with the customer, so maybe call center, right? It includes service delivery like a software system. And then we have customer feedback, of course, that is our measurement for the customer experience. This is where customers evaluate, those upstream operational measures and provide feedback. We can also look at employer feedback or employee feedback, so voice of the employee. Do they have the right tools? What is their perception of the process from a business perspective? And you can ask questions like, well, how does that relate to the customer experience? And finally here, just, the one thing that we're all interested in here, which is ROI, and that's always going to involve bringing in those financial metrics or the financial results or the business outcomes. So those are just a few different data sources. And, given that, first question, sort of thinking about why linkage analysis, right? And as the title of the presentation suggests, the big thing is really establishing a connection between your CX programs or the customer experience and financial outcomes. And so we ask questions like, so what's the bottom line impact of satisfying our customers? Or, is there a return that we can expect from improving the experience? And then we're always thinking about making investments in CX and is it worthwhile? And so those are examples of downstream linkage because we're looking at results that happen after the customer experiences the product or service. So we refer to that as downstream linkage, and this is essentially the ROI story. This is what is the value of your program? What is the value of your experience to the business? But it's really not limited to that. We can look at upstream, which is looking at, your operational metrics and how that drives the customer experience. So from a contact center perspective, we might think about questions like, what's an acceptable hold time? How many transfers are acceptable for the customer? And we can think about a service delivery model, thinking about, automatic updates and Office 365 and the like, and are there key areas of improvement for that service delivery model? Or just thinking about the product in general, like configuration. What are those aspects that have the greatest impact on likelihood to recommend or satisfaction with the product, and subsequently, repurchase, retention, and so on. So with the what and the why, a few different types of analysis, of linkage analysis. I'm going to start off with simple linkage analysis, which is, as the name implies, it's simply linking a single input to a single output. And so we might do things like link customer revenue with satisfaction with the brand. And we would hypothesize that there's a positive relationship here, and this is something that we actually see. So as satisfaction improves, you generally have a higher average revenue associated with customers. We can also think about optimizing operational strategies. So what's the impact of number of transfers on the customer experience? And we see relationships like this where people are kind of okay with maybe one transfer, maybe two, but then you see a rather precipitous decline in customer experience satisfaction as you go beyond that. So you can use that to set best practices. So you don't want to have people transferred more than twice. Another example from the auto industry is thinking about how the experience of the purchase or the buying experience is related to the likelihood of customers coming back to a dealership for service, which is a major revenue stream for dealerships. And we see things, we see things like this relationship where, if you don't have a really good positive, or if you don't have a positive experience buying your car, you're probably not going to go back to that dealership for service. And as you have a better experience, you're more likely to go back. And so that's, an example of simple linkage analysis. And as you'll see when Juraj discusses this, it's, this bivariate sort of approach is really a natural starting point to start to understand the relationships of the data as you build the model. But in and of itself, this can really provide some powerful evidence for that relationship between CX and the business. Now, since we have simple linkage analysis, we also have complex linkage analysis. And this is where we're taking multiple inputs from potentially multiple data sources and using that to explain a single output. So we might think about product configuration impact on satisfaction and repurchasing. So product configuration is going to be a multidimensional measure that could probably come from the same database, but may be in different databases. We can also think about, leveraging our voice of customer, the customer experience, and voice of the employee, and seeing how those two interact with each other and how that works together to predict loyalty. And complex linkage analysis is really going to be more of the focus for URI. It's great when we want to create a predictive model or even just speccing it out. It's a nice way to understand the process and from a more holistic view of the customer. An example of what that might look like is here laid out. So, we could take voice of the employee, we could take operational data, see how they interact together to interact with the customer experience and how that ultimately drives loyalty and customer profitability. So this would be an example of a complex linkage problem. The next thing to sort of talk about is the time element, right? So you can think about linking data together in a cross-sectional framework. So that's just where your data represents a snapshot in time. So we have concurrent observations from multiple data sources that are aligned in time. So we might take a month view or a quarter view or annual view and establish those relationships. It's also, it's a really powerful approach to understanding those relationships in a multi-dimensional way. And it's also, usually it's the most readily available data in the sense that it's, relatively easier to get a snapshot of the customer, whether that's the customer database, the CX database, or whatever you're looking at for a snapshot in time. People can, always reconstruct history, or most often can, but that is an added level of complexity. And as that suggests, we do have the cross-sectional. So the other side of that is a longitudinal approach. And a longitudinal approach takes multiple measurements of the same unit, usually a customer, but it could be a store. It could be, whatever your unit of analysis is. And it takes those measurements through time. So you're following an individual, you're following a location. And this is sort of designed to establish linkages between a particular event or a particular state of being that might have some time for you to realize an impact. And a couple of examples I have here are change in deposits. So, we can measure the strength of the relationship in some time and then see what happens to those average deposits as you go through time. We can also think about retention or attrition, right? Again, those are things that they take some time. So we measure an experience and then it takes time based on that experience to see what happens. We typically have a pre-measurement of the outcome. So, that would be current deposits. It could be concurrent, right? So it could be before your CX measure, it could be after. And then we take a repeated measure of the outcome at a later date. So we're measuring deposits for, individuals at the beginning of the time and then at the end of the time. An example output here for the change in deposits, this is some CX measure. It could be satisfaction, it could be loyalty, it could be transaction experience. And it's broken down into top 2 boxes, so the highly satisfied, then sort of indifferent in the middle 3 box, and then the dissatisfied. And, we would hypothesize again that you would see some kind of a relationship that, happier customers are going to probably spend more. They're probably going to shift more deposits to you as a bank. And this is not an uncommon pattern that we see when we look at linkage, which is there's, it's not uncommon that the cost of dissatisfaction outweighs the benefit of, complete satisfaction. And that's, that my rationale for that is that you don't generally get rewarded for doing something you're supposed to do well. but you can be punished for not doing it well at all. So the retention version, again, another CX metric broken down by those 3 buckets, and everybody's a customer in time period 1, and maybe we look out a year later and see, well, how many of those people are still there? And most of them that are the highly satisfied are still around. You lose a few more for the middle ground, and then you lose a lot. So we're looking at essentially a 25% attrition rate for this dissatisfied group. And it's completely hypothetical, but this is your typical it's your typical pattern. With that, hopefully that sort of level sets what we're talking about at a very high level, gives you some ideas to start you thinking about types of questions you could ask, and what we're talking about with linkage analysis in general. So I'm going to pass it off now to Juraj, who's going to walk you through the process and give you some real information that you can take away. Juraj?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Joseph. This is Juraj, and I will discuss the overall process of the linkage analysis. And as you could see from what Joseph described, linkage is a very general term, and it includes various types of different databases or data linked together. And based on this, we can go with very small projects to very large projects. So for some of the research, I linked together 14 different databases and tens of millions of data. For other projects, it was much smaller and so on. But all of them have several things in common. First, every linkage project is different, and that is what I like the most. So you really need to understand what is going on, what the data what the data tells you, and how to extract important information from the data. But then there are some specific steps in this process, and what I'm going to talk about in the rest of the time is to talk about this process, the steps in the process, and touch on some of the challenges that you may face, so that as you are doing linkage analysis, so that you can increase the probability that the project will be successful. So as you can see here, that there are 5 major steps in the linkage analysis: initial steps, data preparation, exploratory analysis, modeling, and decision support system. And on the next slide, here is each of these 5 steps discussed in more details. So you can see that there are questions that we are trying to answer in each of the steps. So the initial steps, do we have the right data? A very important question. Okay, now, is data ready for linkage? What are the patterns in the data? Can we predict customer behavior, and what to focus on to affect customer behavior? Those 5 different steps. Now, those are general steps in linkage analysis, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every project has all of these steps. Now, we've done some linkage analysis without the simulator. We've done some linkage analysis without blueprinting, for example, and so on. But I am going to talk about those steps in general, what we want to accomplish in each of them, and what we want to be aware of as we proceed along this line. One thing, if you look at the exploratory data analysis and modeling, there are some specific techniques like correlation, factor analysis, nonlinear patterns, decision trees, regression models, partial least-squares, decision trees, and so on. I'm not going to talk about those in depth. There will be the completely different webinar for those, which I would happy to do those. But I just mentioned those as tools to get to where we want to go. So based on this, The first is initial steps. And in the initial steps, we start with planning session. This is very important, very critical for the success, because we need to know where we are going. We need to know what are the objectives, and make clear that everything is clarified and the expectations are set and so on. So it is a planning session with a client where we review the objectives, scope, logistics, and so on. We talked about the review of available data. This is not an in-depth of review. This is just the preliminary session, so that we get to the first introduction to what type of data we can expect, and start forming the analysis plan. Okay, review and finalize process steps and timetable. The timetable is very critical as well. And as you could see, based on different types of linkages, there is also a different time needed to complete this project. So we need to set the expectations on those as well. And of course, what are the deliverables? Are we going to build a what if simulation based on the results, or are just some basic projections enough that we wanted to complete, and so on? And of course, the roles and responsibilities. The next step in the linkage analysis is development of the blueprint. Now, what the blueprint is, as I will mention later on, one of the challenges in modeling is to have a well-specified model, or very often we have under-specified model. What that means is that basically we don't have all important information, all important variables in the model. So what we can do to decrease the risk. Okay, we cannot eliminate the risk completely of having under-specified models, simply because there are so many factors that impact the revenues, the business metrics, and so on. But we can decrease the risk, and one of those steps is this blueprint. What the blueprint is a general, is a snapshot, is a roadmap for the business model in the client company for which we want to build the linkage model. And the way how it is built is we bring in managers and executives from different areas of the company, and we talk about what is important for their part of the business. And as a result, we have a blueprint. We have the scheme as with all the relationships between the key operational product, employee, customer elements, and so on. And the reason for that is that we want to understand that we have the important data linked to the important events that are identified in this blueprint. And so the blueprint may be a very important part of this process. And for example, here is just a hypothetical example of the blueprint. This is for the retail banking, and you can see that we started with the right side, income. That is the outcome. Okay, so we want to have higher income, and now the question is, what contributes to income? And you can see it's commissions, interest, it's fees. What is important, or what determines those three things? And you can see going to the left, it's account activity. And now, how do we? What impacts the account activity? And there is number and types of accounts, and you can see the number of types of accounts depends on share of financial services or wallet. It depends on customer's choice, preference, and or loyalty. And now we are going into more detailed, more specific part of this blueprint. So here you can see on the the right, at the middle is customer choice, preference, and loyalty, where we ended on the previous slide. And this depends on barriers to switching, evaluation of alternatives, but it is impacted by perception of the brand, perception of service experiences, and so on. You can see we are going deeper and deeper into this business model, and always asking the question, so what is important for this specific issue, and what it is impacted by. And you can see on the left we have brand attributes, we have products and services, business processes, facilities and channels. All these impact those items on the right. So we go from the most general to the most specific, and this process continues. I know this is a very small print; you cannot read that probably, but the purpose of this slide is just to explain the complexity of the blueprint. And on the left side, then you can see those are individual service elements. So we have operations. You can see the block that corresponds to employees, block corresponding to customers, business results, exogenous factors. And at the end, we have a set of individual service elements that could be measured, okay? I mentioned could be measured, may or may not, depending on the specific company, but at least those are identified. And we identified what are important service elements in customers. So those are then questions that we need to ask in a survey. And then for the operations, we want to have metrics that measure each of those individual service elements, so that we can build that linkage model. And you can see the business results at the top, at the right. So going from customers to business results, this is the downstream linkage, as Joseph mentioned. Going to the left from customer to operations, this is the upstream linkage. And so the blueprint identifies important service elements. The next question is this data inventory. So now we take those identified service elements and we meet with the data stewards. In general, data is saved in different databases, and different people manage those databases, and it depends on what type of department or part of the company owns the database. There may be very big differences in the way how data is stored, and so we meet with the data stewards, and we discuss specifically what could be used from the database that they own to measure, to quantify each of the service elements identified in the blueprint. So by this, now we have a business model which is very specific to the company. And now we identified individual fields, individual data, which are linked to the service elements. And now you can see that everything is linked together, and we hopefully at the end have we have a system, the data that is reflecting the important part of the business. Now, of course, not all service elements would be available to be measured by the operational metrics. That is the part of the data inventory, to define what data it is, what is the history of the data, what format, what unit of measurement, and so on, is available to decide on what data will be used in this linkage model. Okay, so here are some of the potential data sources. Obviously, survey data, because we are talking about linking customer experience either to ROI or to operational metrics. And then various client databases. It depends on the type of business. Those could be customer databases, employee databases, agent, branch, call center reps, and so on, operational database. HR database, training database. By training, I mean employee training database, communication database, any marketing marketing campaigns, and what was the point, what was the message, and who was targeted by those, billing database, and so on. So all these are potential, and you can see that really not all of them have to be part of the linkage model. Again, it depends on the objectives that we agree upon at the beginning. But those are different possibilities, different situations, and different databases that could be used for the linkage. Okay, now what are we looking at? The variables that we want to use in linkage. So first, the relevance. Okay, so that is, as I explained, is based on what we identified in blueprint. Okay, so are those variables relevant? Just the fact that we have the variable doesn't necessarily mean that we have to use it in linkage. The history is the history related to the time window that we are using for the linkage. The data integrity, what it means is how many missing values. There are different databases is maintained on a different level, and there may be many missing values, or there may be different formats, date formats, or any other variable formats, and so on. Very important part is variables derivation. We sometimes derive variables, so we don't use the raw variable as it is available in the data set, but use some form of transformation to better meet our needs. Okay, so again, those are what I'm talking about here is to give you the point of a wide spectrum of possibilities, and so that's what is so exciting on this linkage analysis in general. So then we go into the data preparation. So now we finish the initial steps in this process. We identify the goal, we identify the business measure, and we identify the data set. Now we go into the data preparation. So what is happening now, the data is transferred to us, and we are starting working with the data. The first thing is looking at the integrity checks. Do we have correct values? What I mean by that is very interesting thing. Sometimes the data simply didn't load well, and there is different values than we would expect for the specific fields. This is the integrity issue. So we want to make sure that everything works as it is. Missing values, again, some databases have many missing values simply because people did not record everything as they should, for example. We look at the outliers. Outliers are very important because they impact any linear type of modeling or measurement, of course, means and so on. One way how to deal with this type of issues is instead of mean to use median or trimmed mean and so on. I will get back to that as well. And I already mentioned formats. Different databases have same things in different formats. In order to merge those together, we need to make sure that everything is lined up in the same format. Now, for the derived variables, I already mentioned that. Let me just give you an example of the derived variable, why it may be so important. And this is just one example. There are many different ways how to apply this concept, but here's an example. So we want to measure a change of checking account balance over time. And this is a very typical situation where we have different customers with a wide variety of balances. And in this case, you can see the first table shows the customer 1 has a balance $100, customer 2 has a balance at $10,000. Now, both of these customers increased their balance. Okay, from time 1 to time 2. So customer 1 to 110, customer 2 to 11,000. If we would simply take a mean of these numbers, the mean would be 5,050 for the first the time, but the variance is very large. So if we would want to measure the change and run a significance test between the two means, because of the large variance, we would most likely not get a statistically significant difference. So what we can do to better measure the impact or the overall change in balance is to standardize these balances. So rather than using $100 or $10,000, we use 100%. Okay, whatever 100% at the beginning is, or any other standardized measure. And then we relate the change to that reference level. And you can see $110 is 110% of $100, and 11,000 is also 110% of 10,000. So now you can see that when we standardize this balance, now we see a very clear movement increase in the balance, and that increase would not be able to be determined in the raw data. So that is an example of importance of the derived variables. And as I mentioned, there are many different ways how to do it, but again, just one example. Then important part is determining operational and business metrics for linking. Business metrics, this is the ROI, but there are different ways how to measure ROI. Is it revenue? Is it number of accounts? Is it renewals, for example, in the insurance companies and so on? So we need to identify what is the metric that is the most critical. It may be part of the blueprint. It may come from that. We may also specifically discuss this issue with the client. And then preparing data for merging. So all of these led to the merging. Now, for the merging, we actually link all interest including variables into one databases. And there are several challenges with the data merging. Again, they are based in the fact that those are databases that are coming from different sources, and they may be very different. Okay, so we talk about individual versus aggregate merging. Individual would be the best if we can merge on individual customer, for example. Now, important thing is if we have a unique ID for the customers, that is the ideal case, because that assures that we have one-on-one merging. If not, we can use email address, name, and so on. But there is an error that is automatically included because people do change names, they move, they change emails, and so on. So we are are introducing inaccuracy, but sometimes this is the only way how we can do it. We need to take into account the points in time, so the time is important. We identify what are those keys by which we are merging the data, and of course the level of measurement and content. The outcome of this is that we have merged the data sets together, and now we have the information from both or more data sets in one file, and now we can actually look at those relationships. That is the goal, what we want to do. The first step in analysis is exploratory analysis. And Joseph already mentioned that. We talk about the basic things, descriptive statistics. There are some ways how to simplify the data, because most of the operational data, for example, are unstructured. There are many values that could be used, that could be part of the fields, and so binning, where we divide all the records into, say, 5 or 10 different groups, is important. Correlations, factor analysis, binary decision trees, those are just some of the techniques used for this exploratory analysis. The goal of the exploratory analysis is to identify the patterns in the data. That's all what we want to find out. Is what are the patterns? And here are some of the examples that we can identify in the pattern. So you can see on the horizontal axis is operational metrics. On the vertical is overall experience. That there is a clear pattern as the operational metrics increases, so increases the overall experience. Here is another pattern. You can see as the operational metrics increases, the overall experiences decreases, and then it stops at some point. This type of pattern could be used for target setting. Okay, here is another one where we actually link 3 variables together. So the first chart shows the proportion of respondents experiencing specific events. The second corresponds to the level of experience, overall experience for those who experience the event or not. So we can link those two together. So as Joseph mentioned, the exploratory analysis results very often in very revealing information, which is very, very important and very useful. And then we start modeling. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. It would deserve a specific webinar just doing that. In general, we divide data randomly on the training and validation data sets. We build the model on the training and validate, compare the performance of models on the validation data sets. There are different ways how to determine which model perfects the best. Next, I would like to spend a few minutes on challenges in linkage modeling. The first one is that we are predicting the pattern, not individual customer. And the reason for that is, so what I was showing, the results and the explanatory analysis are the patterns. So here we have the same data. Okay, on the left side are individual respondents, and 1 point corresponds to 1 respondent. You can see that I just added some random number to each of the points, so that the overall satisfaction, for example, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Now we have the spread, so that we can see the density of the data points. But we could hardly identify any pattern from the left. However, when we use just, for example, the median, you can see on the right there is very clear increasing pattern. So what we want to do is we want to predict the pattern, not the raw data. So the consequence of this is that we are not predicting what John Smith, for example, will do. We are predicting that if you would improve on some performance overall across all the customers, we can expect that there will be an improvement. We don't know who will go up, who will go down, but overall there will be the performance will follow the pattern. Here is another example thing to keep in mind, and this is an hypothetical example where we have a number of business trips, male and females, and we can say that based on this, men travel more than women. Now, however, if you bring in the type of position and look at executives and researchers, and now split the males and females by executive and researcher, we can see that the number of trips does not actually differ significantly between males and females. This is very important concept that we can all very often miss in linkage analysis when we are looking at binary or bivariate type of approach. Joseph already mentioned longitudinal analysis, so I'm not going to spend time on this. And I already mentioned underspecified models. So those are models where we don't have all important characteristics in the model. Again, we do, for example, blueprinting to minimize that. And the important thing to keep in mind is that the model is just a snapshot of the business situation at the time of the data collection. So if anything happens in the future, we are not measuring or controlling for that in the model, our model will not be able to predict that, only based on what we measured. And here is an example of one of the linkage models. So you can see that the outcome is loyalty. And here we have the business measures, share of wallet, purchase frequency, overall sales. And then there are items that are influencing the loyalty, value attributes, service attributes, brand perception, engagements, and so on. So all these go to loyalty. You can see revisit, rewards, and so on. All this is part of the model. Again, it depends on how we design the linkage. Each model may be different. Of course, each model may have different databases that will be used. So for this particular model, we use partial least squares. It may be different, and so on. So we use different techniques. Then this model can be imported into decision support system or the simulator, where we can simulate what actually would happen if we would improve on some specific item. And for example, we have here products, services, and you can see as we move the slider for each of the products. This is snapshot, so it doesn't allow me to dynamically work with this. But that change would be projected into the change in the overall satisfaction, likelihood to recommend, and also in the business metric. At the end, I just would like to again mention that the linkage could be a powerful tool if it is done correctly. I wanted to go through a number of challenges, things to keep in mind as we are doing that this type of analysis. Important things to keep in mind is there are many possible traps along the way. A linkage model is not a crystal ball. It only has the information that we input, and only in that value, in that quality as the quality of the data and the preparation. Any development in the market, as I mentioned, new development, if not controlled in the model, will not reflect that. And that is all. Now we have Q&A.
All right, great. Thanks, Juraj, and thanks, Joseph, for that awesome presentation. Super insight from a couple of super smart market researchers for sure. So I'm certain everyone listening today gained a lot from that, and but I can see there are a ton of questions. So let's get right to those. Joseph, no, Juraj, I'm going to give this one to you, I think. So how long does a typical linkage analysis process take?
This is an excellent question, Tom. And as I hope I explained in my my presentation, there is a wide variety of linkage processes, and the length of time depends on how complex the linkage is, how many databases we want to use in the linkage. In general, the longest period of time it takes from the entire process is getting the data, that initial steps, okay, where we identify the databases, identify what database we want to use, what data is available, and getting the data to us. That is the longest part typically. Once we have the data, then all the process is in our control, so we are going to through all these analytical steps and so on. So overall, I would say that the length of the time for the linkage depends. It varies from 1 to maybe 6 months, sometimes even longer. We had a study where we started this initial discussion with a client, and we finished the study a year later or so. But that was an outlier, if you will. Typically, it lasts between 1 to 6 months.
Okay, great. And Joseph, here's one for you. So how important is it to have customer level data from all of your sources?
Well, it's as Juraj suggested, that was the ideal situation, to have all of your measurements be aligned at the customer level. It's going to provide you the most robust modeling. However, it's not absolutely critical. So, there are other types of modeling approaches that can handle different levels of aggregation. You can think of multi-level modeling, and what that is you can think of a school, for example, where you have students, which are your ultimate unit of analysis, but they're all in different classrooms with different teachers, and so you can take measurements from teachers that would be constant for everybody within that class. So you would still be able to tease out the effect, but ideally you'd want everything measured at the customer level. So you could look at like branches for financial services. There could be a branch effect for customers, or maybe you've got configurations that are going to be the same for a lot of different customers, and then they're going to have different experiences. But it's ideal to have it at the customer level, but it's not prohibitive if you don't for some data sources.
Okay, great. Juraj, let's give this one to you. What part of the linkage analysis process is the most important for the success of the project?
Yeah, again, a very good question. As I mentioned before, I hope that it is clear that the preparation is the key point. So it's identification of the databases, of the data, and then, of course, the quality of the data as well. But those two are the key components. as we know, garbage in, garbage out. So we need to make sure that we have quality data. But at the same time, important thing is to know what we are doing. So the planning process is important.
Okay, thank you. And Joseph, how do you handle companies where different departments own the data needed, and as a result of that, the segmentation is not the same?
So, it's often the case where different departments have, hold different data for sure. It's actually very common, and it's very uncommon for that not to be the case. When that happens, what we I'm sorry, I was trying to find the question again. The different segmentations, I'm assuming, might be different levels of aggregation. If there are different customer segmentations, then those would represent different measures. But the key is to track the customer and connect the customer throughout the databases. If it is a level of aggregation, just like we mentioned before, while it's not ideal to have, where it's ideal to have individual customer information, different levels of aggregation to complete the picture are something that we've worked with and still provide pretty useful results. And if there's a follow-up question to that, please submit it and we can answer that through email.
Yeah, and I did want to say that's a good point. So if we do not get to your question today, we will either Joseph or Juraj will get back with you with an answer. But let's move forward with the time we have remaining. Juraj, how easy is the linkage model modifiable and scalable once implemented? Is growth in a company a part of the blueprint design and enhancements time to implement considered in this analysis?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, sure. How easy is a linkage model modifiable and scalable once implemented? And maybe we'll start with that first part of the question first.
It is relatively easy. Now it depends on what is meant by the adjustment, scalability, and so on. But since the linkage model has been developed, we can enter new information to the model later at a point. Actually, it is recommended to repeat the linkage modeling after some period of time to update the model with the newest data. Okay, so that is relatively easy to do. And of course, depending on what is the outcome, then from the model, that outcome then is transferred to the simulator. So again, that may be relatively easy. And as a matter of fact, the way how we used to build the simulator is that it is relatively easy to add additional areas, additional features, additional operational metrics, and so on to the simulator as it was completed.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like, so we're getting close to the top of the hour. Maybe one more question, Joseph. What kind of deliverables would we expect beyond the simulator for a typical linkage analysis?
It really kind of depends on the project. I think Juraj might have alluded to that. The simulator is a tool for clients to use to perform what-if scenarios, to identify new strategies, hypothesize what those impacts might be on the experience, for example, or on operational metrics, and then finally understand what your outcome is after that. But it's also often the case that it's an iterative process, and so we work through different scenarios and deliver a PowerPoint along that with recommendations for business partners internally. So it can run the gamut. The big deliverable is the simulator, but that's generally for the research folks who like to run those scenarios. So, obviously, walking through insights and recommended paths and potential impacts are what we would also recommend as part of the deliverables.
Awesome, thanks. And that does take us to the top of the hour, and that's going to conclude us for today. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Uri. A lot of prep went into this and a great presentation. So thank you, and thanks for answering those questions. Thanks for those that submitted questions. And if we did not get to yours, again, Uri or Joseph will be reaching out to you with your answers. And then also look for, within the next 24 hours, a link to the recording of this presentation. So again, that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you for joining us. And until next time, we'll thank you on behalf of MaritzCX.